All right. Good morning and welcome, everybody. This is the Cost of Conformity, How Provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act Could Impact Indiana's Budget. Brought to you by Prosperity Indiana and co-hosted by the Indiana Assets and Opportunity Network with our special guest from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Let's go ahead to the next slide and talk about what's on tap today. So today's discussion, first of all, I want to start out with why we're here today and why we're doing it now. As folks on the line may recall, when the Indiana General Assembly decided that they were going to take on a special session, which became an early session, there were two topics that were publicly reported. One was mid-decade congressional redistricting, and that process is played out. But the other one was conformity with tax provisions from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And we haven't seen that arise yet, at least when I'm looking at the bills that have been introduced, we haven't seen that released publicly yet. But we wanted to take this opportunity, especially just before the regular part of the session begins, to talk with some national experts and see what that could mean for Indiana's revenue and budget picture. So today we're going to do some welcome and introductions from the presenters that you see here. I encourage folks online, if you would, use the chat feature to introduce yourself and your organization so that we have an idea of who's here and who's interested in joining us today. And once we get through those introductions, we're going to have our presentation from Neva Butkus about the analysis on the impacts of state revenue from tax conformity. Then we're going to have plenty of time for audience Q&A and then wrap up with some next steps that Prosperity Indiana and the Indiana Asset and Opportunity Network have planned. So let's go to the next slide so that you know who's talking to you today. I'm Andrew Bradley. I'm Senior Director of Policy and Strategy with Prosperity Indiana. If you're not familiar with Prosperity Indiana, we are the statewide association for community economic development. And 2026 will be our 40th anniversary. So that will be 40 years of providing resources, engagement, advocacy, and programs to our statewide network of over 200 members. We say that we are strengthening Indiana's communities and improving Hoosiers' lives. And you can see the spectrum of members that we have here across the full array of nonprofits, also public entities and private individuals and organizations as well, all committed to improving housing and economic opportunity. And frankly, housing may be the issue that the public knows us the most for, but many of our members are just as involved in improving economic outcomes for households and for their communities. And for that reason, we do a lot of work in coalition convening, and one of those coalitions is the Indiana Assets and Opportunity Network. So to introduce their work, I'm really happy to introduce our new colleague, Rachel Cheeseman, who is Prosperity Indiana's policy manager, has been on for about 2 months, is hitting it out of the park so far. And before I hand it off to Rachel, I do want to mention that part of the reason that we are doing this is to provide one strong voice for advocacy for our sector. And that's the reason why we're doing this and why we're co-hosting it as both Prosperity Indiana and the Indiana Assets and Opportunity Network. So this is we're providing this information so that you can be informed, so that our policymakers and the general public knows what's on the table for these issues. So Rachel, over to you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Rachel Cheeseman, and I joined Prosperity Indiana's team at about 2 months ago. And one of the primary role that I have is in facilitating the work of our coalition. So Prosperity Indiana has 3 coalitions that we really lean into, one of which is the Assets and Opportunity work. We also have the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition and Hoosiers for Responsible Lending, which is a spinoff or subgenre of the Assets and Opportunity work focused pretty specifically on preventing economic exploitation of people through unfair lending practices. But with the Assets and Opportunity Network, see, and I am, oh, good. I was worried I had the slides out of order. So with the Assets and Opportunity Network, we are really focused on financial empowerment and advocating for policies that allow households to build up assets for long-term savings, for education, for, whatever their goals are in the long term. And that also involves investments in the, all of those things. They require a certain amount of investment. And the reason that is so relevant to the topic that we're having, or the conversation that we're having today, is that when the state is looking to cut its budget, it is often going to look at investments it sees as optional first. And unfortunately, investments in households and service providers are sometimes seen as optional. So the Assets and Opportunity Network is really focused on informing and empowering advocates to make sure that we're at the table to stand up for the work that we do and the value that it brings, not just to households, but also to the state at large. I'll go over our 2026 policy priorities from this coalition really quickly. We do want to support Hoosiers in building those near and long-term savings, including ensuring that the K through 12 financial literacy requirement is implemented in a way that is robust and age-appropriate and culturally appropriate. And we also want to prevent temporary need from causing long-term harm. Medical debt has been a big topic of study at the legislature, and it's also a big point of advocacy for the members of the Assets and Opportunity Network, because somebody needing healthcare is not something that should prevent them from saving in the long term and achieving whatever goals they have for their future. And then we also want to defend and improve the public programs that stabilize vulnerable Hoosiers. And that is where we really get into the topic that we are covering today, and trying to ensure that any budget shortfalls, are mitigated at the front, hopefully, or are not managed in a way that causes more harm to the families that we call neighbors and to each other. So I think that with that, I will pass it back to Andrew so he can introduce our lead presenter today. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks, Rachel. And so we are really privileged today to be joined by a long-term partner of Prosperity Indiana's and the Indiana Asset and Opportunity Network. Neva Butkus is Senior Analyst at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. You may have recalled, if you've been following us for a while, that we've worked with ITEP in the past. We've co-released the Indiana state version of their Who Pays report, a distributional analysis of Indiana's state tax structure compared to other states. And you can see right here, Neva supports researchers and advocates in their fight for equitable and adequate state tax systems. Previously, Neva was with the Louisiana Budget Project, and actually that's where I first met Neva, where her research and advocacy included issues of corporate tax policy, working family tax credits, unemployment insurance, and K-12 finance policy. So ITEP in general, and Neva in particular, are national tax experts, and we are really lucky for them to be able to share what they've learned about the One Big Beautiful Act and tax conformity, and specifically put it in context for Indiana's tax structure and what Hoosiers can expect if that issue is taken up in the next session of the General Assembly. So Neva, thank you so much for joining us, and we're turning it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you and good morning. Thank you all so much for joining me to talk about some pretty wonky tax stuff the Thursday before many of you are probably heading out on your holiday vacation. So I really, really appreciate it. I know tax policy sometimes isn't like the most like a fun conversation for folks. I really love it. I'm gonna make it I'm gonna make it really fun. And yeah, we're gonna talk about a lot of really great stuff and how it's going to impact Indiana. Again, my name is Neva Butkus, and I'm a senior analyst here at ITEP. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan tax policy organization. We value tax equity and adequacy and believe that government at every level thrives when it has enough revenue to fund important priorities that strengthen communities and workers and families. And it thrives also when that revenue is raised equitably, and meaning it does not disproportionately ask low and middle income households to contribute to the services that every single one of us benefit from. As tax experts at ITEP, we regularly advise state advocates and lawmakers and other policy shops on what makes good tax policy, which is why I'm here today to talk to all of you. This presentation will be on the recently passed federal bill, often referred to as OBBA or OB3, or the Trump tax law. So I might use those kind of interchangeably throughout the presentation. Conformity, which we will dive into what that means and what it means for Hoosiers and Indiana as a whole as well, will also be a big part of this presentation. Again, some of these topics are going to seem a little wonky and in the weeds, but please join me in evaluating these tax policies and decisions and ask me questions. I am a firm believer that tax policy is for everyone, whether you work in health or education policy, whether you work in direct services, whether you are just an involved citizen whose profession is nothing near tax policy, or so you think, because I think everything is involved in tax policy. All of us pay taxes, and we deserve transparency around the decisions made by our elected officials that fund our governments that exist to make our lives better. So with that, we can get started. So quick overview of what we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to talk about Indiana's general fiscal landscape, what happened this session. We'll talk about OBBA in general. I'm just going to say OB3, honestly, y'all. It's a lot easier. What passed, what was in the federal bill, and who benefits from it. We'll talk about conformity. What is it? What does it mean for Indiana and other states? We'll talk about conformity issues and the tax changes that are going to be most likely to impact Indiana's budget. And we'll talk about revenue options through conformity and some other options that we think Indiana should consider as you look ahead to the upcoming fiscal years. Next slide, please. So we will start off with the fiscal landscape of Indiana. It's no secret to anyone on this call that a deficit is lingering over the budget of Indiana, and it had some impacts on decisions that were made this last session, right? So the state is currently projecting a $2 to $2.4 billion deficit for the 2025 to 2027 budget period. That it had no small impact on the decisions that were made this year. So $200 million were cut from the Child Care and Development Fund. There was a bipartisan $500 tax credit for families with newborns that had unanimous support in the Senate and stalled due to funding concerns. And allocations to agencies were pretty much cut across the board, right? So this isn't unique to Indiana. Most states are currently staring down less than rosy fiscal situations. A lot of states use their post-pandemic surpluses to fund tax cuts, despite warnings from tax and budget experts and advocates that the surpluses in their budget were the result of temporary federal relief and would not be recurring, and that being hasty and cutting income taxes in particular could lead to deficits in the very near future once those surplus dried up and the economy slowed down. So unfortunately, this drying surplus is not the only concern at the moment. The state budgets, for state budgets and lawmakers. So in Indiana, the voucher program is increasingly costing more each year. There are trickle-down effects from the federal tax and spending bill that will soon be realized as states are trying to absorb more program costs for SNAP and Medicaid. Indiana has been more susceptible than other states to the recent trade war because of its economy. It's very heavily dependent on manufacturing and agriculture. Tariffs have been increasingly eating into the budgets of hardworking Hoosier families. Yeah, the economy is just generally slowing. Revenue collections are down across the board in many states, and it's exacerbating deficits and eating into surpluses. And the federal tax bill, or OB3, is going to reduce the state tax base even further, which is mostly why, again, I'm here to talk to you today. So let's first go into tax changes made by OB3. So we can go to the next slide too, really quickly. I want to start this section by saying that, I work on the state side of ITEP. I should be able to answer most questions about the federal bill, but if there is something particularly in the weeds on the federal side, I may need to circle back to you after consulting with our federal policy team, who spends a lot more time day to day on this at the federal level than me, who spends more time on how it intersects with the state level and state tax policy. In the bill, many provisions from TCJA, or the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which is the current tax structure we are operating in at the federal level, from Trump's first term, were extended or modified. So you can see the list here, some of the major ones. They were going to be expiring at the end of 2025. They have been extended. So that is our current rate and brackets, the standard deduction increase, and getting rid of the personal exemption. There was a child tax credit increase of $200, but important to note that it did not change refundability of the child tax credit at the federal level. The pass-through deduction, the alternative minimum tax, itemized deduction changes, and changes to the estate tax. All of these things in total are going to be costing the federal government $402 billion in 2026. And they also made numerous changes to the tax code that were marketed as provisions for middle class taxpayers. So this included the deduction for tipped income, the deduction for overtime pay, an enhanced deduction for seniors, an exclusion for car loan interest. And these in total cost about $58 billion, so significantly less than the first slide. Then there were many business tax breaks that were included. So there is the pass-through deduction that extended from TCJA, but they also, and we're going to go into some of these and how they'll impact Indiana, but there were changes to bonus depreciation, research expensing, new international corporate rules. They modified opportunity zones. There's even more than this list, but this list totaled in terms of business tax breaks, totals about $165 billion in revenue loss. And then some tax provisions were raising money, not enough to fund the rest of them, but this included the repeal and phase out of green tax provisions for energy, limits on the Affordable Care Act credits, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with because that's been dominating a lot of conversation at the state and federal level right now, a 1% floor on corporate charitable deductions, and more. This raises about $56 billion for 2026. But who does this help? There are a lot of changes here, right? And a big chunk of them are branded as for the middle class. But who actually benefits from these changes? And we know at ITEP. So in this slide, you will see that 72% of the tax benefits going to households in the top 20% of income earners. Now the top 20% is a pretty big bucket because it ranges from households that make about $150,000 to, like infinity. But just to demonstrate how regressive this really is, we broke that down, that top 20% for you. There is a kind of top 15% and then a top 4 and then a top 1 in those buckets. So the top 5% of American households will be receiving 46% of the benefits of OB3's tax cut. These are households with incomes above $361,000 a year. And the top 1% will receive 22% of the total benefit of this tax cut. These are households with incomes above $916,900 a year. So I think anyone could probably objectively say from this graphic that the middle class is not really the demographic that is getting the best deal from this bill. But what does that mean for Hoosiers? That is federal impact for the whole country. But we can tell you that too. So the trickle-down effects in terms of how it's going to change federal tax liability for people in Indiana. Hoosier household in the bottom 20% of income earners, so that's somebody earning less than about $27,000 a year, is going to see an average tax cut of about $90 annually. A Hoosier household right smack in the middle, making between about $55-ish to $87,000 a year, they're going to receive a tax cut of about $1,670 on average. And if you are a family trying to make ends meet and you have kids, that's nothing to gawk at, right? Like that's going to go a long way in helping you catch up with your light bill and things like that. But I know a lot of families that could use $1,600. But if you are in the richest 1% of Hoosiers, somebody making upwards of $792,000 a year, you are going to be receiving an average tax cut of about $56,000 to $57,000 a year. And based on our data here, that is more than about 40% of Hoosier households even take home in a year. It's just about what the average teacher, I think, makes in the state of Indiana, I think, which is just a couple grand higher than that. So just to put it into perspective of how big that tax cut is going to be for the top 1% in terms of what they will no longer be paying in federal taxes. This next chart, I think, is also really important because it's going to show the impacts of recent policies holistically alongside OB3. This chart shows the tax change from OB3 by quintile as a percentage of income. So the average person in the bottom 20% saw a tax cut that was the equivalent of 0.3% of their annual income. The top 1% is getting a tax cut of about 2.4% of their annual income. This helps us understand how regressive something is outside of just like the numerical tax cut people would be receiving. But for nearly 80% of households, the tax savings from OB3 is going to be entirely eaten up by tariffs. Obviously, these tariffs are changing a bit week to week, month to month, sometimes day to day. And because of that, our federal team is pretty conservatively estimated the impact from tariffs here, since they are changing by quintile. But that also means that it likely is worse than this chart during various points in time. So as you'll see here, for the bottom 20%, they are going to be spending significantly more in tariffs than they received in the tax cut from OB3. That is also the case for the next 20%, the third 20%, and mostly for the fourth 20%. It's about break even there too. So yes, this is that pretty much has eaten up any tax benefit for low and middle income families. So we talked about the background on info on Indiana's fiscal situation and OB3. And that context is really important, but the primary reason I'm here to talk to you today is about conformity in Indiana's tax code and what it means for the state. So what is conformity, right? We'll start with the basics. Yeah, what is conformity? It might be a word you've heard thrown around outside of this webinar recently in the media or the State House. States use the federal tax code as a starting point when it's time to calculate personal and corporate income taxes. So instead of coming up with their own definition of income, most states just use federal adjusted gross income or federal AGI to begin their income tax forms. Some states use federal taxable income, which is the amount of income the federal government will actually tax you on after deductions and things like that. But again, most states, including Indiana, use federal AGI. And while states that use federal taxable income might be more susceptible to conformity changes because it includes more like stuff that could change, the definition of federal AGI is also susceptible to changes. And in short, when the federal government changes the things that make up that definition, it's also going to change how much income is available for states to use to calculate their taxes. So another important term to know in regards to conformity is whether a state has static or rolling conformity. Indiana is static, which is makes it a little bit of an outlier, but multiple states do have it. And this means that the state does not automatically adopt changes at the federal level. Some of you may know more about this than you think, because this is why I think Indiana's EITC was like technically coupled to like a previous old federal law. Even after changes that expanded at the federal level, Indiana's EITC only, kept the benefit increase by after 2 kids and things like that. That is because of static conformity. So as of today, Indiana conforms to the federal tax code as it exists on January 1st, 2023. So as of right now, some of the changes that were made at the federal level are not impacting Indiana. Those lawmakers will have to choose what they want to outside of federal AGI, because that definition is just baked into the state's tax code, and that is what it is. So what changed to federal AGI? The main components that are going to alter adjusted gross income include changes to opportunity zones for individuals and corporations, changes to 529 accounts for private school tuition, the Trump accounts, which were recently created, changes to qualified small business stock, and dependent care FSAs or flex spending accounts. We will go over some of these items in more depth than others as we chat, but there are also some changes to business taxes. So additionally, changes were made to business taxes that will impact tax calculations in Indiana if the state chooses to conform to them. In Indiana, there is a special depreciation allowance for qualified production property that the state has identified as something they would either need to conform to or not. That's going to be different from the federal tax code. This is basically a provision that will allow factory real property, which is just a fancy word of saying buildings, used for manufacturing to take a 100% bonus depreciation deduction. So a bonus depreciation is just the immediate writing off of the cost of property in the year it was placed in service rather than over time. And it has generally been reserved for things like machinery or equipment, not actual buildings. So that now the buildings that the manufacturing is actually conducted in could potentially have this tax write-off. So another business tax change that won't really impact Indiana, but will impact other states is a new full deduction for research and experimental expenditures. In TCJA, this deduction was reduced from 100% to 1/5 of the expenditures for it. But OB3 increased this back to 100%. Indiana, however, already allowed this deduction at 100%. So the other states just are basically making the choice of as whether they want to like be with y'all at 100%. But since you are already decoupled technically from this provision, even though you're going to mirror the federal tax code, you're not going to lose money in the state same way other states are that are going to be forcibly pushed up to 100%. But I wanted to flag this because while it isn't going to automatically lose Indiana additional revenue, the statute is written for the state does not require that these investments in R&D are done in Indiana or for Indiana companies, just domestically. So while there are obviously companies in Indiana that are creating a lot of jobs in the sector of R&D, this deduction could also just be subsidizing R&D happening out of state, which I think is just very important to note for this conversation. So let's go through some of the tax changes that are most likely going to impact Indiana's budget and talk about some of the fiscal impact of those changes. So we're going to weigh the cost of a few of these. The first are opportunity zones. So that is one policy change that is going to impact federal AGI. I mean, it's just already baked in for Indiana and is going to lose money for the state automatically unless the state chooses to reject it. An opportunity zone is a geographic area that gets preferential tax treatment for investors who choose to develop and invest in those areas. These are often areas that are lower income, but tend to be near like urban centers, not always, but that is where you'll usually find them. They were created under TCJ and additional changes were made in OB3 that will cost states more money who are coupled to them. At ITEC, we recommend states take a really hard look at these programs because there's a lot of evidence, they've been around for a while, that they can create development, but they don't really create jobs, which is one of their, intended purposes when this was created and written into law. We also want you to take a strong look at them because the most important incentives that are creating this development are the tax benefit that these developers are getting from the federal level. The state layering on doesn't do a whole lot. So you're basically just subsidizing investment that was probably already going to happen. And you could be subsidizing out-of-state investors just through Indiana's tax code. Another reason to take a hard look at it is that it's expensive. Indiana has not published estimates on these various provisions and what the state expects them to cost, but a lot of states have. About a dozen states at this point have published estimates on most of the provisions in OB3 and how they'll impact their state. So I just wanted to give you a few of those so you can see what these are costing other states and what they're estimating. So Arizona is expecting this to cost 42.8 million by FY27. Colorado, 40 to 50 million. Minnesota, 87 million by FY28. So just so you can kind of see where the ballpark of Indiana could be. The second is the qualified small business stock. This is a provision that has kind of quietly existed in the federal tax code for decades. It allows wealthy, mostly venture capitalists, an exemption of 100% on gains when they cash out on early stage investments in companies that have soared in value. Basically, some stock, to put it like really bluntly, some stock, mostly from small startups, small tech startups, get this designation to spur investment. Then when they become profitable and they grow in value, these investors cash out their investment and pay no tax on these capital gains. It is an incredibly regressive policy. 94% of the people of the benefit of this policy, of the tax exclusion, go to households with incomes upwards of $1 million a year. And the worst part of this, I think, for the states is that these companies don't exist really in Indiana. They're mostly in Silicon Valley. But so you are basically subsidizing very wealthy Hoosiers to invest in Silicon Valley tech startups and then give them the tax write-off for doing so. Some states have published estimates on this, but this is a thing that ITEP has also been able to model. So the only state I would say that I think has so far decoupled from it and rejected this provision outright is the District of Columbia. And ITEP modeling has shown that this would result in $14.4 million of new revenue for Indiana by 2031 if the state rejected this provision. So it is not the most expensive component of OB3, but it is those millions of dollars are not spurring investment in Indiana companies or Indiana startups. It is just a tax break to send your money out of state for very, very, very wealthy people. We've written a really great report on qualified small business stock. So anyone interested in learning more, you can go to our website. A lot of these topics we've written recent reports on. So there are a few other provisions that I wanted to touch on that will lose money for Indiana because they impact federal adjusted gross income. So we have the 529 accounts for private K-12 schools, the Trump accounts and the dependent care FSAs. While the latter two of the three are not like the best policies to achieve the goals they're touted to achieve, they're also not very expensive. So we don't need to go into those very deeply. However, the 529 accounts for private K-12 schools is being expanded to use it for more tuition and more different expenses for private education. And it's also being layered on the state's already very expensive voucher program. So it's kind of a double whammy for the state when it comes to subsidizing private schools with public tax dollars. And then the business tax breaks. So we talked about the special depreciation allowance for manufacturing to allow the buildings to also receive the special depreciation allowance and deduction. This has been by far, I think, the most popular policy for states to reject outright. So far, Delaware, DC, Illinois, Maine, Michigan, Pennsylvania, there might be others that have already decoupled, and they haven't even started their 2026, sessions really yet. They have already come in and said, we do not want this. It is expensive, and have just rejected it outright. And it is expensive. We can see here, when Illinois chose to forego it, it saved the state $144 million in FY26. For Maine, that was about $23 million. For Michigan, it was about $45 million. So many states have chosen to reject this, and for good reason, because they were about to lose out on a lot of money. So the last kind of component of OB3 I wanted to touch on are the tips and overtime deductions. I want to be very clear that Indiana is not automatically coupled to these provisions, but they are picking up a lot of steam around the country. Michigan chose to actively couple to both of them, and we are really urging states to push back on these efforts. Coupling to the tipped and overtime deduction in OB3 would cost Indiana around $161 million in 2026. And they could cost a lot more. Estimating these have been really hard because we can't predict how many companies would reclassify employees and jobs to take advantage of this. Corporations could start reclassifying salaried workers as hourly wage and hold overtime over their head to get them to work more hours so they don't have to hire more people. There's just a lot of loopholes that can be opened up with these provisions. The guidance from the Treasury as well, from the federal Treasury, on who could qualify for this has also been really flexible, meaning it's not just your bartenders and wait staff that could potentially benefit from these provisions when we think of tipped workers. The first year, they're anticipating consultants, if they qualify or in the income range, could take advantage of this. Later on, they're considering, HVAC workers, people who are not traditionally tipped employees. So because we don't know because the definition of job sector is so fluid that they have issued, we have no idea how much this could cost, and states don't either. And it could really be a runaway cost, and it's just not a policy that is going to help many workers. It is undeniable that many working class folks in Indiana and around the country are struggling to make ends meet right now. But these deductions are very short-sighted. They disrupt horizontal equity in the tax system, and very few people are going to benefit from. Why should a child care worker making $30,000 and a bartender making $30,000 all of a sudden pay different amounts in taxes? It doesn't make sense. Instead, we would urge any lawmakers that are looking to policies to help working class folks to boost the EITC, increase the minimum wage, go after policies that are going to lift up all workers and not create special carve-outs here and there. So lastly, now that we've gone through OB3 and what's in it, what are the major components of it that are going to impact Indiana kind of outright? Let's talk about closing the deficit and setting Indiana up for success fiscally in the future. So how can we use conformity and other revenue options to make sure Hoosiers are getting the services they want and need? So the first is when you're in a hole, stop digging. That is, I think, really sound advice when it comes to budgets. Again, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of states use their post-pandemic surpluses to cut income taxes despite warnings from advocates and budget analysts. Indiana cut taxes in 2022. They started phasing down the personal income tax rate. It was at 3% in 2025. It's going down to 2.9% from 3.23% in 2022. And this, I think, when it was signed into law by the previous governor, was expected to cost around $900 million annually when it was fully implemented per year. Stopping and reversing these cuts is really imperative to Indiana closing the deficit and protecting public services. So that is, I think, that can be step number one. But let's talk about some new revenue ideas too. So the first two I wanted to talk about are worldwide combined reporting and GILTI, or global intangible low taxed income. The vast, vast majority of Americans do not believe corporations are paying their fair share. And this transcends political party. It is a very popular idea, and most people believe this, and they would be right. These two policies can help close loopholes for very large corporations with a lot of subsidiaries in other states and in other countries. So the first is worldwide combined reporting, which I think is really the gold standard of closing loopholes for these corporations. And it essentially just prevents corporations from shifting income around from a subsidiary in Delaware to Nevada to the Bahamas or what have you, to artificially lower their tax liability in a specific state, even though that profit was made in that state. So Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan, Kentucky, they all already enact water's edge combined reporting, which means they prevent corporations from moving money around in subsidiaries in other states, American states. But the really gold standard of this is to extend this offshore as well. If Indiana were to do that, it would bring in $434 million in new revenue. We have written up a report on this as well that was published early 2025. The other option is GILTI. So this is global intangible low tax income. This was altered a bit in OB3. It is now rebranded as net CFC tested income. I love how it still has an acronym even in the full name of it. It's a tax on profits of foreign subsidiaries of U.S. parent companies. So it's similar to worldwide combined reporting, but a little bit different in scope. Indiana does not tax GILTI, but so many states do at a certain amount. The federal government taxes it at, I believe, 50%. There's the new definition, and they've altered the rates a little bit. But Indiana doesn't tax it, but Illinois passed it earlier this year to help close their budget gap. They're taxing it at 50%. Idaho, but this isn't reserved to just blue states. Idaho, Nebraska, Minnesota, Montana, Utah, West Virginia, they all tax a portion of GILTI. Some of them might tax just maybe like 5 to 10% of it, some 50% or more. So these are two really strong options to ensure that corporations are contributing fully, large corporations are contributing fully to Indiana's public services that they absolutely benefit from. When Indiana's universities are well funded and K-12 schools are running well, those companies benefit from the workforce at those schools are creating, and they should contribute. So and not get very nice, expensive corporate loopholes. Okay, new revenue. So this is an idea that ITEP has been talking to a few states about. It's called the wealth proceeds tax, and it is basically a tax on comprehensive capital gains. Similar to corporations, the vast majority of Americans also do not believe that the wealthiest among us are paying their fair share. So, enter the wealth proceeds tax. This is a definition that exists at the federal level. The IRC does identify it. It's net investment income. It includes capital gains, dividends, interest, certain types of rent, royalties, business income, certain types of business income, certain types of annuity income, what have you. At the federal level, you only pay this tax if you have a household income of over $250,000 as a married filer. And it's a pretty modest tax still. It's only 3.8% on proceeds over that threshold. So if you're a married household and your combined income, like salary of both spouses, is $200,000, and that's your salary, your actual income, and you got $75,000 in capital gains or net investment income that year, you would just pay 3.8% on 25,000, just the amount over that 250. And that is like the equivalent of like $950. It's really not that much money, but it's a very equitable policy. Minnesota in 2023 decided to tax this also at the state level. They just enacted it as just 1%, and they made it over a $1 million threshold. So they didn't even couple to the federal threshold of $250,000. If Indiana, because y'all's income tax rate is so low, if Indiana were just going to implement an additional 3%, so less than the federal threshold or less than the federal tax on these gains using the federal threshold of $250,000 for married filing jointly, that would raise about $260 million annually, just asking upper middle class and high income households to pay a little bit extra on their capital gains. This does not touch, if you were just a doctor or you were an anesthesiologist making $400,000 a year, you are not impacted by this tax unless you have capital gains. Your salary or your wages from your hospital are not touched. So this helps. This is important because a lot of people's income from investments, this is passive income. You aren't clocking in at your job and busting your butt to get this income. You just were able to cash out on something that made a lot of money that you invested in. And I think asking people to pay just a little bit extra so that we can have good schools and well-paid teachers and early childhood education makes a lot of sense. Okay, so this is bringing us to the end. Some concluding thoughts, and then I'm happy to take some questions. So it's really tough out there, y'all. Americans are struggling. Hoosiers are struggling. Many of you know that. And state budgets are looking grim, but solutions exist. And we just need some political willpower to prioritize these solutions that we know center working Hoosiers and that are just trying to pay their mortgage and save a little for their kids' college and fix their car. Not multimillionaires, not billionaires, and not large, very profitable corporations who don't need the additional tax breaks at the expense of hardworking people who are just trying to make ends meet. And conformity and some of these revenue options can play a very big role in taking a step in that direction. So thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'd be happy to take a few questions.
First of all, let me say thank you so much, Neva. This is really an amazing presentation. We already had requests for the slides, and I went ahead and told people, yes, we're planning to share those with folks. I'm not seeing yet any questions in the chat, but feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand. And actually, I see our first hand raised is Amy Chandler.
Hello, friends. Are there arguments that are particularly useful for lawmakers who don't super care about middle and low income people and they want to bring businesses to the state? Just in theory, not like a real thing that Indiana might, this is just the hypothetical.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Amy. I get this question probably more during presentations than almost any other question, actually.
Mhm.
Because I work in a lot of states that are, very politically diverse. I live in Louisiana. Like, this is something that I think about a lot. So I really appreciate the question. I think that there is, I think even a lot of state lawmakers really want to do right by their communities. That, they, and it has been proven time and time again that the things that attract business or grow business are strong economies that are supported by very good public services. People do not want to move where universities are being defunded left and right and your public schools can't retain teachers because families aren't going to move there. People aren't going to move there for work. I also think there's something to be said because um, that is definitely something, or a conversation that often happens in Louisiana where I live is like, how do we like attract people? And as a Louisianan and as someone whose like family's been here for like 400 years, I get very frustrated because I feel like, and I know, I mean, I know a lot of people in Indiana are the same. Their families have been there for generations. Um, do we not want to invest in those people, the people that have made this state, the people that have built this state? There is so much talent that could be unlocked if we invested in schools, if we invested in early childhood, if we ensured people had good jobs and good wages. That is how we can lift from the bottom up. And why do we want people who haven't already invested to? I mean, nothing against them, but like, the attraction angle of this just makes no sense to me. And I think people need to hear that why do you want your lawmakers trying to attract someone for this high paying job in order to like make your state better, as opposed to fund your child's schools so that your child and your family who have already built this state and been here for 4 generations can continue to grow and thrive and make this state better and stronger for everyone. So does that argument work? I don't know.
I love that though.
Yeah.
We've seen our lawmakers want to listen to their constituents with some of this redistricting. And now it would be great to be able to encourage them. You have families that have lived in your community for 10 generations. Make sure they're taken care of. I don't, in general, super like that, like close in mindset, but to get good policy done, sometimes you have to get outside of that. So I appreciate that answer.
It's not that we don't want other people moving here, but prioritizing attracting wealthy out of state people over folks that already live in your state. I think that should make people mad. And I think that lawmakers across the aisle do need to hear that because the like anti-tax talent attraction talking points have been so strong in their ear for so long that I think maybe some of them, if they hear it framed a little bit differently, would start to think about things a little bit differently.
I appreciate that. Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks, Amy. I see Caleb has his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of jump off of that and provide another argument that might work, might not, hard to say until you try it. But, I think there's a lot of talk about making Indiana a state that is friendly to businesses, which is a great idea, of course. But I think, trying to attract, wealthy out-of-state venture capitalists, ultimately, it's not super business friendly because a business needs customers. So a strong economy needs people that are going out and taking advantage of restaurants, shops, whatever other businesses we have here in our state. And if we're trying to just make it attractive for out of state investors who are ultimately just going to probably hoard that capital rather than going out and spending it in the community, that actually has the opposite effect of what we are wanting it to have. So, it's kind of two sides of the same coin there, but I just wanted to jump off of what Neva had said there, that, we need to make it possible for people that live here to participate in the economy.
100%. Thank you, Caleb. Totally agree.
Neva, we have Rodney has a question, and then I've got one. I'll put my hand up as well. So Rodney, you go ahead.
Okay, I love the slides. I think they did a great job in really explaining inequities when it comes to policies. What I would like for economists and really to get together and have a coherent scorecard, maybe call it the policy fairness scorecard. And when you look at policies, earned income tax credit, I give it an A. Invested in pre-K education, an A. Maybe school vouchers, a D. Home repair program, an A. And the reason I say that is recently I had a discussion with a member of city council, and they voted for a program that I didn't think was very equitable. And that program was to give credits back to existing homeowners. And when I look at homeowners getting a tax credit as opposed to a home repair program, I'd say the argument is the more equitable one is to have a home repair program. And after talking to the member of council, he kind of got it and said, yeah, that wasn't the best policy to implement in our city. So I think if we had a clear measure, it would be easier for members of state houses, Senate to make those decisions to say, hey, here's a nonpartisan that has a rating. And if we implement this program, the school voucher program is very inequitable, and these are the people that are getting the benefits. And I would love something like that.
Yeah, our shtick, if you will, is at ITEP is tax incidence. So we have a micro simulation model. I didn't need to use it very much for the analysis and discussion for this presentation, since it was more about like the bulk of these policies in terms of their cost in the budget. But most of my job is evaluating policy decisions at local and the state level and understanding the distributional impacts of those. And we can do that for property tax programs often as well. So Rodney, I'm not sure what your profession is, but if you do work in local policy, I would definitely connect with our local team at ITEP, who spends a lot of time thinking about this, especially in regards to homeownership and property taxes. That is a big part of their work. And understanding the equity implications of those policies.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Rodney. So I'm going to jump in with my question, but I want to keep encouraging people either raise your hand and or put your questions in the chat. We don't have to stop right at 11. So I think we'll have an opportunity to get to anyone who has a question. So my question is, going back through, I was writing down numbers as you were going through the specific provisions of the tax conformity, and I came up with at least $220 million that Indiana would lose in additional revenue if we do conformity on the qualified small business stock, the business breaks for manufacturing depreciation, and the tips and overtime. So just those alone. And so that's 220 million. That equals, or that's about the same as the cuts to childcare in our last budget. So that just setting up that like we would need to anticipate in the next budget session having to come up with or a cut to some sort of service or somewhere else in the budget of that amount. So that alone, stepping back though, this next session is not a budget session. So it's kind of a special circumstance where the Indiana General Assembly is going to be considering a tax issue in a non-budget session. So my question for you, Neva, is assuming that there's not going to be like pay-fors in a piece of legislation or other things aren't on the table, if we were to give recommendations to legislators based on just the options that are within the tax conformity from one big beautiful act, what would you say we should focus on recommending so that we don't further exacerbate Indiana's upside down tax structure?
Yeah, great question. I would make sure you hold the line on tips and overtime because again, that's generating a lot of conversation. I think it sounds really good to people. People know tipped workers don't make a lot of money and they want to help them out, but holding the line and pushing back on any lawmakers or efforts that try to couple to those provisions because Indiana, as of right now, isn't coupled to them. You're not going to lose that, I think, $160 million from that unless they choose to do so. So yeah, holding the line on those. I do think that the 100% bonus depreciation deduction for manufacturing buildings, it would be a very strong policy to push back on because states, blue and mostly purple, like states like Pennsylvania, have already said no, thank you. There is a very strong case to be made. And we know that one is going to be like a heavy hitter for Indiana. It is not, it wasn't cheap in those states. It's probably not going to be cheap to implement here as well. So I would push back on that. And then I think really encouraging lawmakers to take a strong look at the Opportunity Zone program and qualified small business stock would be the next up on my list. At the very least, I think we need to understand what they would cost and pushing the Indiana Department of Revenue to publish estimates on all of these things so that lawmakers have transparency and the public has transparency about these provisions and what they're going to cost the state is out in the open. And so people can actually make smart decisions about what breaks they want to give and what they want to prioritize in Indiana. But people deserve to know the numbers.
Thanks so much. And I see Rachel has a question. Rachel, go ahead.
I do have a question. Thank you so much for doing this. As a former friendly neighborhood tax lady, this is, fiscal policy is something I wind up thinking about a lot. And I'm curious to know, coming from the low income tax assistance world, we have talked a lot about the generative capacity as far as economic impact for investments in things like a child tax credit, a newborn tax credit, expanding the EITC. And I'm wondering, because somebody mentioned capital hoarding when you invest in tax breaks for kind of that richest 5%. So does ITEP have any numbers on like when you invest in a child tax credit, that every dollar is actually $1.75 in economic activity for your state? Do we have a comparable figure for when those benefits redound to the highest income earners?
I do not off the top of my head.
Okay.
But it is, it has been proven time and time again that, yeah, when you invest in things like refundable credits for low and middle income families, the economic activity that it's spurred by that is much higher than giving additional tax breaks to the wealthiest among us. So, because I mean, for a lot of the reasons that make a lot of sense, right? So when you are a low income family and you get an extra boost on your tax return from your EITC, it's not going to, your second lake house in a different state. It's going to like replace your tires at the auto body shop down the street. It's going to buy diapers at your local grocery store for your kids. It is being like they take it in and it is immediately spent back out into the local economy. Yeah, almost like immediate turnaround as opposed to additional tax breaks for folks that already have investment on investment and on investment. And very few of those investments likely are in the state of Indiana. Many of them are out of state.
So I'll shoehorn that into another just kind of like side question. What are some of the things that you have seen states do with the money they save from decoupling? I know I was particularly excited when I read about what DC chose to do,
Yeah.
but if you have any other examples that you'd like to share with the group, I'd love for them to know like what's possible if we are able to preserve some of this revenue or grow some new revenue to be able to invest in Hoosier families.
Yes, I love that question because my intern is just finishing up a blog actually on some of these changes and what they were spent on. So yes, for those of you that don't know, the District of Columbia had passed a pretty substantial child tax credit a few years ago, and it was set to go into effect in 2026. The city's budget kind of went into dire straits and they had to postpone it. It was no longer going to happen in 2026. DC then took the opportunity with conformity to decouple from qualified small business stock, from bonus depreciation, and I think a few other things, and use that money to go refund their child tax credit again, which I think is about like $1,000 for young children, and goes up to a fairly high threshold for households in terms of income as well. It really encompasses like all low and middle income households in DC. So yeah, they took that money and they spent it on funding their credits. I think they also used it to make sure all EITC recipients are getting 100% match to the federal credit. Before it was, I think, only for childless workers, and they were slowly bumping up families to 100% as well. And I think they used it to do that too. Pennsylvania is another example. So Pennsylvania's budget, if I'm being honest, there were some things in it that we didn't like totally love too at ITEP, but they used their decoupling from bonus depreciation. They made a few other modifications, and they used some of that income to pass the state's first earned income tax credit. This has been a hard-fought battle by advocates in Pennsylvania. For decades, they have been pushing for this. Pennsylvania has kind of been an outlier for a long time in the Northeast with no refundable credit. And they got it over the finish line. I think it's 10%, but it's the state's first refundable tax credit. And it was a huge win. And it was funded and in no small part to their ability to decouple from some of these conformity changes that they didn't want to prioritize.
Thanks, Neva. I do see a question in the chat from Chuck. He's asking, any brief thoughts on the effects Medicaid cuts and changes made?
Yeah, a great question, Chuck. Thank you. ITEP's scope is really focused, since that we focus mostly on the tax component of things. I would maybe not be the person to ask what that impact's going to be on the state budget, but I would very much encourage you to look onto our partner organization's website, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. They have published quite a bit on Medicaid cuts and SNAP cuts and the impact that's going to have on state budgets and what they should expect coming down the pipeline.
Thanks, Neva. And to that point, that's something that Prosperity Indiana and the Indiana Asset and Opportunity Network, the steering committee, has expressed interest in. Is I don't think in Indiana, at least, we haven't seen a really holistic picture of the impacts of the One Big Beautiful Act on Hoosier families and communities, including Medicaid, including these tax conformity provisions. So that is probably a project that may end up happening after the end of the state legislative session, but it's definitely something we're keeping an eye on. And Amy, I see your hand.
More quick clarifying question. So in Indiana, our lawmakers have to take positive action to decouple, or they have to do nothing. Remind me what the next step is again, because I didn't get that.
It's both. Yeah. Some states it's one or the other. Y'all are one of those states, because you have static, that it's going to be both. So anything that's going to impact federal adjusted gross income is just already baked into it, because if you lower federal adjusted gross income and how much that number is at the federal level, it's also getting lowered at Indiana, unless Indiana says we want to get rid of opportunity zones as part of this calculation. Boop, and then it'll go back up and be a little bit different than federal AGI as they use it, right? So, but the other components of it, so like the bonus depreciation, tips and overtime. So bonus depreciation for manufacturing buildings would be automatic if they just said, like, we just want to adopt the federal tax code as it stands on December 18th, 2025. Bonus depreciation would get baked in unless they actively rejected it. But if they said, we want to adopt the federal tax code as of December 18th, 2025, tips and overtime would, in some of the other components, would not be baked in, because it doesn't affect federal AGI, if that makes sense. It's a lot of it's a lot. But
So
yeah, it depends on where things fall in terms of, like, before AGI is calculated, after AGI is calculated. Is it an extra corporate tax break? Is it part of corporate AGI? You know, there's multiple layers to it. This is why accountants get paid a lot of money. So
yeah. Okay, thank you.
Well, Neva, thanks so much. I'm going to take a privilege and ask one last question, and then we'll wrap up. So, the early, it wasn't a special session. It was an early part of the 2026 session is over. And so our state lawmakers are back in their communities. And we have, as you can see, so many partners here who are, there are members and coalition partners, and they may not be tax experts. And then a lot of the lawmakers, frankly, are not tax experts. But for our members that might bump into their legislators at the grocery store or at a community event over the holidays before everybody's back at the State House on January 5th, what advice would you give for, in a brief interaction, like what's the right type of question to ask, or what kind of thing should our partners give a heads up to those legislators about
Yeah.
this issue?
Another great question. I think you could press them on priorities, right? So, like, are they really comfortable with the decision to allow manufacturing companies to get a tax break on their buildings versus defund, cutting money from the child care development fund? Like, is that really what they think their constituents care about, or what's actually going to help their constituents is passing that and not refunding this? I think that's what I would ask them. Do you really want to keep a tax break on capital gains for tech startups, so that wealthy Hoosiers can spend their money investing in Silicon Valley, as opposed to funding childcare, as opposed to funding hospitals and child and family services or teachers? Like it, and if they say yes, then that's their prerogative. They were elected. But yeah, that's what I would press them on. Is that your priority? Is that what you think your constituents care about? And is that what you think actually is going to make a difference in the lives of Hoosiers that are struggling to pay their light bill and their mortgage and their rent?
Thanks so much. And I think that's great advice for that interaction at the grocery store or a community event. And then if that does happen, when we will send all the participants the slides and the links, and then they can follow up with those legislators and send them all this great information so they can have some reasoning for those decisions when they come back in January. So with that, Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you to take us home in terms of our next steps, some things we have coming up, and some follow-up information.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrew and Neva. I just want to close this out with some, standard housekeeping. Thank you all so much for coming today. This type of, information sharing and getting the analysts in the room so you can hear directly from them is a big part of what we hope to do as a membership association for Indiana's community economic development sector. And so we hope that you will consider joining us as members. This is our 40th anniversary, so it's an exciting time. We're really looking forward to the next 40 years to see what we can advocate for and make possible for the families that we serve. And our Prosperity Indiana members are the ones who really drive our policy agenda. So every year we solicit our policy priorities from our members and ask, like, what's affecting you? What are the things that need to change for you to be able to do your work? And so we want to be able to hear from you. And now more than ever, we just really need to be organized, and we need to be together, and we need to make sure that our lawmakers are hearing from us all throughout the year, not just during the legislative session. At Policy and Pizza in Lafayette, we heard from Senator Deary, and he was like, I just feel so bad when I vote on something and then I hear from a constituent after the fact. And so we want to make sure that they're hearing from us all year. And then I also just want to briefly talk about our coalition work. You do not have to be members to participate in the Assets and Opportunity Coalition. That is where you can talk about the difference that you would see made for the people you serve if we were able to pull through on certain investments, collecting revenue to be able to invest in our low income, moderate income, middle class households. And so please consider joining the Indiana Assets and Opportunity Network. The QR code on that slide will let you sign up for updates from us. That's how you get our quarterly newsletter for the coalition and also action alerts when we are in session. And there's an opportunity to push your lawmakers on things like investing in a newborn tax credit. You can also sign up for Prosperity Indiana's newsletter using the other QR code there. And then we do have some other programming coming up. So mark your calendars for our advocacy series. It's a 3-part series, no charge. Each session is 1 hour. They take place on these dates from 1 to 2. And that all culminates in our State House Day, where we are at the Capitol. You're meeting with lawmakers, you're participating directly in the legislative process, and we're making sure that your legislators hear from you. We've heard that this is going to be a short session, but we do anticipate that lawmakers will be at work on February 12th, and you will be able to talk to them, and we hope that you'll join us. So thank you all so much for coming. The slides will have Andrew's and my contact information when we circulate them after this webinar closes. And you will also get a recording. You will get the slides. And Neva, I'm going to ping you. You mentioned a report that you had done, and I would love to include that as well. So I will
send over like 5 reports.
Yeah, send all the reports.
Okay, I'll send all the reports.
We'll send you all the reports. So thank you all so much for coming today. And if you have any final questions, feel free to stay on. Andrew and I will be here for another 10 minutes or so.
And let's give one final, thanks, Rachel. One final round of applause virtually for Neva. Thank you so much for this information. I really appreciate your ongoing partnership with and informing Hoosiers for these decisions.
Yeah, thank you all for the work that you do for everybody in your state. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks everybody. Happy holidays.
Do you have a question, Andrew, if you're going to stay on? Is this something that PI is going to be pushing this session? Like, where are we with that? I just don't know much about how we deal with taxes. I haven't paid attention.
Thanks. And I think that we've stopped the recording. And so,
Yeah.
So now
wait,
just
no, it
kind
is
of,
still going.
talking. Oh, that's right. And that's okay.